Shalom, everybody, and welcome to St. Jude and St. James Evening Bible Study. On Tuesday, our Hebraic Roots Bible Study, where we like to wrestle with the text in context, which means we try and look at its not just linguistic features, the Hebrew, but also the Jewish world thought. And acknowledge, yes, good evening, right, acknowledge that you and I are part of a tradition called the Judeo-Christian tradition, that we understand that our faith in Jesus the Messiah comes from the Jewish world. And tonight we're going to be wrestling with, apart from the Psalm for the week or the day, Ecclesiastes Part 2. We're studying together the book of Kohelet, or also known as Ecclesiastes in our English Bibles. So, my name is Deacon Aaron, and I'm the Deacon of St. Jude and St. James, and it's my pleasure to study with you and just wrestle with some of the issues that go on in Ecclesiastes, the book that struggled to get into the Bible, basically because of the questions that it asked, and I guess a lot of people weren't very happy with a lot of the answers. But before we jump into the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, our tradition is to look at a psalm, usually the psalm for the day, and or the Sunday, or for the communion service of Tuesday. Why are so many Anglican priests becoming Catholic? First question. Look, I have absolutely no idea. It could be because they're dissatisfied with the leadership. Bad shepherds. Now, there's bad shepherds in many denominations, and there's no excuse for bad shepherds. If you want to know how God feels about bad shepherds, just read Ezekiel 34. It could be that people sort of look for a firm foundation. They look for something that hasn't changed. One of the reasons why I like the Anglican tradition is I'm part of something bigger than myself, right? It's not just me and my little church that's been going on for 10 years and will only go on for another 10 once our pastor leaves. I'm part of something that's bigger than me. It's called the kingdom of heaven. It's often reflected in churches that are historic, and there's lots of them. And united, you can do a lot more. So, it's very difficult for one church to build a hospital. It's a lot easier when there's 1,000 of them. So, our psalm for this week that we're going to wrestle with is Psalm 40. And we're just going to be looking at the first 12 verses, or just a few of the verses inside. This is it's called to the chief musician, a psalm of David, which in Hebrew is actually verse 1. It's Lemenatzer le David Mizmor. That's actually part of the psalm. We just use it as like the title. So David, our king, is writing, and what does he say? He says, I'm reading from the New King James here. He goes, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me, and he heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay. He set my feet upon a rock, and he established my steps. So we see that the psalm starts with acknowledging that he's in trouble. And it doesn't define what the trouble is. It's quite deep for him because he talks about a horrible pit. Now, we don't know what's going on in his life. It could be part of the story early on when he's engaging in a civil war with King Saul. And David never sort of wins that one. He's always running away. He never gains the army or the followers to be able to challenge Saul in battle, and he actually never wants to. He sort of waits until King Saul is actually defeated by the Philistines, and then David can ascend to the throne, even though he's the Lord's anointed. That is an interesting lesson for us, isn't it? Often some of us would say, I've got a calling from the Lord, and everybody else just has to get out of my way. Perhaps we should take a little bit more patient, humble approach. And here, that's what you get in verse 1, don't you? I waited patiently for the Lord. I'm in lots of trouble. I'm in a deep, dark pit. There's all kinds of mess going on in my life. But I'm going to wait for my Redeemer to act. Now, interestingly, the Hebrew here is not the word for patience, as we would understand it, savlanut in Hebrew. long-suffering. The word here used is kaveh, which is the root word for hope. The word for hope in Hebrew is tikva, and the shoresh, the root of it, is kaveh, and that's what you see here. So by waiting patiently, it also includes the sense of hope. There's a hopeful expectation that the Lord will eventually act on David's behalf or on our behalf. So when we find ourselves in trouble, and there's a very good chance that most of us will sooner or later encounter a difficult time, then be patient. And in that patience, have hope that the Lord will act on your behalf and will act in your favor and will bring just resolution. Or as Paul says it, all things work for good. Not just some things or the good things work for good, but all things, which just boggles your mind when you say, no, the days are evil. And yet somehow that works for good because God is that powerful. And so after the redemption, or as part of the redemptive process, David says that the Lord actually firms me up. He gives me a firm foundation. Okay, put my feet upon a rock. Great symbol, good biblical metaphor, a rock, to firm, solid grounding. God often described as well as being a rock, sort of old, ancient, hard, and can actually stand the test of time. And David feels good. He gets a song put in his mouth. So he actually praises the Lord. Not only does he say thank you, and we always should bless the Lord for the good things that we have, maybe even the bad things. There's something for us, but actually sing songs unto the Lord. I like verse 6 because it gives us a 7 and 8, because it gives us again context to the psalm. David says, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire." Now that is an interesting thing to say, isn't it? Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. But we've got the book of Leviticus, and it's full of sacrifices, and God seems to there be quite emphatic that this is actually what you will do. And Jesus in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, says when you bring your offering, okay, at the altar, what offering are we talking about here? Could be grain, which is a sacrifice. Could be a bird. Could be some sort of animal. And then if you have a problem with your brother, leave your offering and then go and reconcile, and then come back. So why does God on one hand say, please bring me a sacrifice, and then David on the other hand says, well, that's actually not what you want? And there seems to be a tension in the text, and that's a Hebraic concept, the idea of tension, where things that are diametrically opposed are actually held in tension. You don't try and solve the issue, you reflect on it. This is often, verses like this is not the only one. There are several of the prophets say exactly the same thing. The blood of bulls and goats I didn't want, I didn't desire. What do I really desire? I desire your heart. And it's always been about the heart. Right? Write these laws on your heart, Deuteronomy. Or in Jeremiah 31, the new covenant, I'll write these laws, the Torah, back on your heart. Circumcise your heart. Create in me a clean heart, hands and heart, O Lord, says David. The heart really is the key aspect of the relationship that we have with God. But that doesn't mean that sacrifices and offerings don't have value. They're just not the be-all and end-all of the relationship. This is often also why when Jews and Christians have modern-day debates, and you get those lovely Christians who like to sort of go, hey, you Jews don't have a temple, so therefore you can't offer sacrifices, therefore you can't get rid of any of your sin. They'll just point to verses like this and say, yeah, but that's not the point, is it? It's actually about your heart. And you have to go, you know what? Yep, that's actually true. And the ears you open, burnt offering and sin offering you didn't require. Then I said, behold, I come. The scroll of the book is written of me. God has a name. inscribed in a book, our name, the Lamb's Book of Life. And what's our response to the salvation of God? Verse 8, I delight to do your will. There is this joy in actually being obedient to our King. And your law, verse 8, where is it? Do they throw it away? No, it's within my heart. But in the law, right, is the book of Leviticus with all of its sacrifices. And so there's that tension, right? There's that tension. It's so easy for us to try and think of faith or whatever, sort of this linear progression, when really it's a lot more dynamic than that. And you see this reflected in the Psalms. Now, the Psalms are prayers, and prayers are theology. You pray what you believe, okay? I remember being in Jerusalem for 26 years, and every now and again you'd meet lovely brothers and sisters on their personal pilgrimages, and you might be having coffee with them or talking to them, and they'll say, you know what, Aaron, me and Jesus, we're tight. It's, oh, great, good. It's great to hear. But then when you pray together, then they say, dear Lord, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm really in a bit of a mess. That's where you really are. That's where you really feel. And that's actually what you really believe. And so listening to your prayers is actually incredibly, incredibly important. And that's why you find in traditional churches, they are very diligent in writing their prayers out, right? They think about them and they go, oh, if I'm going to say to God something, I better make sure I say it right. So they don't just fly off the cuff and say something dumb. They write out their prayers. And so in the Bible, you find both forms. You find liturgical prayers, things like the Psalms, but you also find free-form prayers. People just pray, and you should do both. Right? You should express what's in your heart to the Lord. Listen to yourself, so you actually know where your heart is. But you can also pick up a psalm and just read those prayers and pray those prayers. Thousands of years old, yes, but absolutely packed with theology that's still relevant to this day. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. Excellent. So that's Psalm, or parts of Psalm 40, verses 1 to 12. All right, so we're going to jump now, or move to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, which is our the book that we're going to be wrestling with here at St. Jude and St. James for a while, also known as Kohelet in Hebrew. And just for memory and reflection from the previous last week, this is one of the three books that just almost didn't make it into the Bible. The sages were struggling with Kohelet, and why? Because of its subject matter. It didn't seem to be a very positive book. It reflected a lot of angst, anxiety, and one of the most common phrases, everything is meaningless. And people struggle with, well, why would we put that woeful piece of rubbish in the text? They also knew that this book, gave us a heavy dose of reality. People knew and believed that God was in charge. You and I believe that God is in charge. You believe and I believe that the Messiah is sitting on the throne. He's ruling and reigning. Excellent. And then we open our eyes and we look around and we go, wow, if he's ruling and reigning, why is it all still a mess? And we have to wrestle with that tension. We have to try and understand, what does it look like for God to rule and reign through us, and for us to also, just like David said in Psalm 40, perhaps be waiting patiently for the Lord to act and do something. So a lot of those issues are wrestled with and struggled with by the writer of Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes being the Greek name, which we get from Septuagint, which is the Greek of the Hebrew Kohelet. Kahal being the word for assembly or congregation, kehilah in Hebrew, leading to the English ecclesia, the Greek of ecclesia, which when you translate that is the word for church. Okay, so a church is just simply the word in English for assembly. But it's become sometimes to represent also a building and a denomination and a whole lot more than actually the word, the original word meant, Kohelet. Kohelet is a feminine word, and it relates to the name or title of the teacher, or the leader of the assembly, sometimes translated as preacher or teacher, which is a really bad translation. The leader of the assembly. The authors are known, as we discussed last week, but we have the suspicion that it's King Solomon because of the way he describes his wisdom, and without, he doesn't assign himself a name on that, but he also will in today's chapter give a little bit more biography about himself, which will describe his wealth and the pursuits that he did through his wealth. That is through pleasure, building activity, sort of achievements, and things like that. Why are so many Christians convinced Jesus is the Jewish Messiah? Well, he's certainly not the Gentile Messiah, because Gentiles don't have a Messiah. It's the Gentile world. This is the pagan world. It didn't do redeemer figures. The Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, you pick a religion, then redeemer figures were sort of absent. We wanted to go and talk to God or experience the Lord. We sort of had to go to find mountaintop experiences, go visit oracles, find crazy druids guarding God inside trees and things like that. It's the Jewish world that brings us the Redeemer, and that's what in Hebrew Goel, and then of course that eventually leads us to Yeshua or Jesus hanging out in first century Judea, and good question though, thank you. All right, so going into the background of chapter 1, he just began by starting out by saying, you know what, I've looked at the world and it's meaningless to me. I'm trying to find meaning. And actually, this is a good question. And so it's actually a really good idea that this book was included in the text, in the Bible, because people do search for meaning. That's just an honest discussion. People do search for meaning in the world. Whether it's through philosophy or asking questions, running through science, poetry, you pick it. People look at the world and I'm trying to make sense of how things work. But Jesus didn't fulfill any of the prophecies. Yeah, he did. Many of them. Which one are you referring to that he didn't? Is this an objection? This is not really the forum for those debates, but I'm happy to have one. But so looking at meaningless, the sage, the writer, I'll call him Kohelet, most likely could be Solomon. Okay, he looks for what truly is meaning. Where do I find it? And now he's supposed to be the wisest person on the planet. So this book, by definition, probably shouldn't exist per se, in the effect that he wasn't even from the bloodline of David. That's what the Gospels will say. There'll be 2 genealogies, one in Luke, one in Matthew. I'm not 100% sure you've actually read the Gospels, Maxwell, because you get the genealogy there. So, and they both attest to him coming from the line of Judah. So, in both, whether you go, because the bloodline goes through Mary as well. She's both Levite and Judah in her bloodline. So both genealogies lead to Joseph? No, both genealogies also include Mary. Don't forget that. And Mary's genealogy goes through Judah as well. But again, thanks for the question. The Mary's genealogy is, you'll find it in Luke. Luke, the genealogy of Luke adds Mary's genealogy there as well, and you'll also find it in where Zachariah and Anna, her parents are also from that tribe. All right, so we're on to chapter 2. So the Kohelet says, "I said in my heart, come now. I will test you with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity." And so the English here is, I will look for joy. How will I find meaning in the world? Well, one of the ways that it's no, Luke didn't lie. This is you and I should have a discussion off script on this one. Let's stick with Ecclesiastes, okay? But thank you for the question. Okay. Although if you have a good look at the genealogies, you'll look and you'll find Mary's in there, and Mary is assigned as a lineage to Judah. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. People look for joy. One way of trying to find meaning in the world is to look for some sort of joy. Without joy, what are some of the absences where you end up in people having no joy? Depression, emptiness. There's a real sense of emptiness without joy. So one of the fruits of the Spirit, which you see in Galatians, one of the things that you get when you have the presence of God in your life, or in your community, in your family, is joy. Yes, peace, love, self-control, and a whole bunch of other things. That's excellent. Joy is also there. But here, the Kohelet says, I will try and go and find pleasure. I'll try and find things that are good, or joy. And he uses that word simcha, sameach, which really does talk about laughter. And so verse 2, you hear it. I said of laughter, it's just madness. And of mirth, what does it accomplish? The joy fades. It doesn't stay or sit as long, as nice as that is. Although we can reflect and remember good times, I think a lot of us here who are sitting and listening could probably close our eyes or look to a friend or family that's near us and say, I remember some good times, okay? Times where we laughed, times that were joyful. Those are often times that are good. Rarely do we, although some people do, rarely do we look at a time that was without joy and call it good. We might have learned something through a hard time and then call that good, but more often than not, it's because of joy and laughter. And so the Kohelet tries to find meaning with his wisdom. And remember, he's got his wisdom, and he applies his wisdom to pursuits of pleasure. Does this mean that our dear brother Kohelet is running himself into sin? So I'm really smart, I'm really wise, and I'll just leap to sin. If Solomon was so wise and so smart, then how come the book of Ecclesiastes is so long? How come it takes him so long to actually come to his conclusion in chapter 12? Why doesn't the person full of wisdom just say, what is the meaning to life? Well, God made the world, and God's got everything in control, and everything's in the hands of heaven. So there you go. God's got it all great. But he doesn't do that. He actually has a hard look at reality, and he applies his wisdom in looking for pleasure. Does he then try and engage in sin? Well, I'm not 100% sure yet. So we'll just keep that on the back burner. Verse 3 says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine. So he, while guarding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold of folly, until I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. Now, there's a couple of key words and phrases that are jumping up, and this one is he looks for alcohol. What makes him happy is wine, is imbibing spirits and the fruit of the vine. Is that a sin? Here you have to be careful in the effect that the Proverbs and the wisdom is, do not let your drunkenness cause you to sin. See, one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. One of the things that we'd like to be is in self-control. It's one of the attributes of God. He is in control. When we're out of control, then you can get into trouble. And so one of the ways to get out of control is when you are intoxicated. You don't think right, or your control mechanisms are sort of out of whack. You are inhibited. You don't control your tongue. You say all kinds of crazy things. And you also might actually engage in sinful activity. And so it's a refrain from being drunk. Now, there are some traditions and denominations which then sort of move the pendulum quite far out and say, well, if the warning is don't let drunkenness cause you to sin, let's make being drunk a sin, and therefore you won't even do that. So you won't even get tempted to be drunk and get into sin. Well, our dear brother here, the writer of Ecclesiastes, the Kohelet, should we assume no one's lying? Maxwell, nice try, but if you leave your email, I'll contact you after this, okay? And we can have a discussion. All right. So the pendulum swing was, if we want to get drunk, we won't get drunk because we'll call that a sin. Here, the guy full of wisdom applies himself, drinks heavily, and what does he find? He ends up discovering that it's actually just no, Maxwell, you really probably should depart. Bye. And but if you'd like to leave your email, let's get in contact. Challenge you to it. Okay. He then proceeds to look for building great works, and he builds himself. He builds houses, plants vineyards. So he's got some wealth. All right. And he made himself gardens and orchards, and he planted all kinds of fruit trees. So he seeks to endeavor to do these great accomplishments, building works, architecture, agriculture, to see if he can find meaning in those things. But he doesn't. And which is interesting, isn't it? Because we've actually had whole civilizations that have built grandiose buildings. We appreciate grandiose buildings. I know that most of us, when we go and visit other places on holidays, while most of us probably don't spend all our times in the hotels, we go and see great works. Bridges, gardens, nice boulevards, fancy restaurants, castles, cathedrals, things like that. And we look at them and we go, wow, great big buildings. Solomon, or the Kohelet, goes out and does exactly the same thing, and again still finds that this doesn't satisfy. There's no sense of meaning. Now, the key word that he has here is in verse 3, where I might see what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven, tachat hashemesh, or is it tachat hashamayim, under the heavens. In the other chapter, it's what's nothing new under the sun, tachat hashemesh. This is a key phrase, because he's looking for meaning under heaven. He's looking for meaning only in this world, and so no matter what he's going to go look for, he's not going to find it. And that's going to be the problem that you will find with atheists, people who don't believe in anything beyond death. If death is the finality, everything truly has no meaning. It might be enjoyable, just like looking for good wine and building nice buildings and having a really good time, but it doesn't last. And so this is where Kohelet's actually quite a useful text, because it challenges us on making sure that our worldview isn't locked and trapped just to this realm, that we acknowledge also the world to come. And in the Hebrew mindset, that's the way you called it. You called it this world and the world to come. Olam hazeh, this world, and the Olam haba, the world to come. The way often in Christian speak, it's like, I can't wait to get to heaven. So like the place we're going to is heaven. Although Jesus himself in the Beatitudes says the meek inherit the earth. It's a very Jewish thing to frame the world to come as a world that looks a lot like this one. So our brother, the Kohelet, is wrestling with the idea that possessions are not making him happy. They don't satisfy. Verse 7, he acquires male and female servants. That's a tough one for us to wrestle with sometimes, because we live in a world where none of us actually really like slavery. Just so you know, neither does the Bible, even though you do have verses which tell you how to care for slaves. So the scriptures understand that in context, thousands of years ago, and unfortunately the modern day, but thousands of years ago, there were communities, including the Jewish one, that they themselves were slaves, but they had the ability to own slaves. However, the slaves are not 100% like what we understand as slavery, where you sort of capture people and force them to work in the salt mines and things like that. The ideal is to set them free. So there was a time period where they could be an indentured servants. Sometimes people would have to sell themselves into slavery to pay off a debt. Now, that would happen, and the Bible had created that for the society, but that was never the goal. And the end result was to let them go free. And so you see those tensions in the text. So here you have the smartest man on the planet. Now one would be thinking, hey, smart man, surely you should know that we're not meant to have male and female slaves. And he goes, well, we do. And I had a lot of them. And there are all kinds of reasons why he had them. Now, indentured servants can also get paid. So maybe the word can be quite obscure. Does it actually refer to someone paying off a debt that they got involved with, or are they on a special wage of some form and some sort of social contract, or are they actually possessions in the effect that they may have been captured in a war, but eventually they are meant to be set free and, with good fortune, join the house of God by adopting the faith of the master, and which would hopefully be then monotheism. And so in verse 7, he acquires male and female servants and the many born into his house. I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. So we really are talking about a person who has got lots of possessions. And we discover that money doesn't make people happy. Now, this is not to say that the Bible is denying wealth. Okay, that's it. And only the poor are happy. That actually might be true. Okay, and you also get that tension. Remember, we're always talking about Hebraic tension. You find verses like Jesus giving us a warning. It's hard for rich people to get into the kingdom of heaven. However, you also have, on the other hand, that wealth can be a blessing from God. If God's going to bless you, one of the ways he might do it is actually to bless you with possessions. And if you happen to have lots of possessions, you can thank God for it. So there's no inherent evilness to the possession of wealth. What's the problem is Kohelet says it doesn't actually provide any sense of meaning. It only has a value based on vis-a-vis a relationship you might have with God, and vis-a-vis you might have a relationship with each other. What do I do with my wealth? What do I do if I've got a big house? Do I open it up to allow people in? Do I actually, allow the poor and my friends to come and stay? Or do I shut everybody away and I fail to take care of my own flesh and blood? And then you suddenly realize, now you have a problem. And so wealth, like a lot of the things we're discussing, has that tension that's wrapped around it, and it can be good or bad. Here, the writer of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, he's got a lot of wealth, but what he does is he discovers it doesn't satisfy. In verse 9, it says, he becomes great and he excelled more than all those who were before me. So Solomon, in terms of the kingdom of Solomon, that's the time when the realm of Israel, as we might know it from the Bible, reaches its height. Okay, it expands north, south, east, and then Solomon also extends his trading empire. He his nation knew prosperity and wealth. In his wisdom, though, he fails to bring up his kids right. Okay, so the smartest man on the planet, okay, apparently didn't. While he says he is applying his wisdom, perhaps also applied it inappropriately in some ways, and his kingdom's actually ripped apart by his kids. Prophesied to be so, but ripped apart by his kids. He says, he became great, he excelled more than all those who were before me, and also his wisdom remained with me. It's interesting, isn't it? The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. That's actually from Romans. And so often, if we've been given a gift from God, even if we're not using it, the gift is still there. We might have to answer for that a little bit later, but it remains. And so even though those of us, some of us might be watching, might be having a faith crisis, right, where we struggle with some of the questions, we're wrestling with some of the questions that our Kohelet guys are asking. Is everything meaningless? Is there really a God? What's really going on? The gifts that God is giving you haven't disappeared. Okay, and for Solomon, he says his wisdom remains, but it says in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward. Right? He has lots of treasure and lots of possessions. So he has broken some of the rules that were given to a king that we find in Deuteronomy 17. So in the book of Deuteronomy, which is Moses's final words, it's the single longest monologue in the entire Bible. Okay, 34 chapters, written by a guy who starts his career saying, "I don't know how to talk," but by the end of his career, he's pretty much figured it out. As he's giving the big pep talk for Israel to go into the land of Canaan and set up what's supposed to be a moral and just and ethical society and a light to the nations, he says, in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, when you get into the land, appoint yourself a king. When you do get a king, make sure he writes a copy of the Bible, doesn't get a lot of horses, doesn't get a lot of women, and doesn't get a lot of gold. Well, Solomon seems to have broken 3 of those. Bit strange, but why does a person so smart ignore the words of the Lord? Don't know. Okay, but he does, and then he discovers that all of the things he was told he not to get, they didn't satisfy anyway. Maybe if he'd listened to God in the first place, might have saved him a lot of trouble. But he admits here that he's actually broken the rules that he was not supposed to. He didn't keep his eyes, whatever his eyes desired, he took. Complete lack of self-control. Is he admitting here to committing sins? Doesn't actually say per se. Let's remember he did have 300 wives and 700 concubines, although while the Bible says the commands are don't have many wives, the fact that he had married them, many of them might have been political marriages, they're not technically illegal. Gets him into lots of trouble though, because instead of asking his brides, which many of them could have been marriages just for the sake of alliances with nations around, he doesn't ask them to adhere to his God. He allows them to introduce paganism and idolatry into his people. Very poor choice. In verse 11, he says, I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on all the labor in which I had toiled. A lot of this was perfectly legitimate pleasure. And he realized that even perfectly legitimate pleasure had no meaning. Does that mean everything we're doing right now has no meaning? Is that what he's saying? Well, let's remember the key phrases that you find in chapters 1 and 2. Tachat Hashemes, under the sun, Tachat Hashemayim, under heaven. He's looking at things under heaven. He's looking at things only in the temporal world. And in chapter 3, those words won't be found. Chapter 3, he doesn't say it's not under heaven, it's not under somewhere. Instead, what you get is there's a time for absolutely everything. And it's as though the wisdom is coming back. You see in the Jewish sages, if you remember from last week, the Jewish sages wrestle with Solomon being so smart, yet saying things so dumb. And so they say that Solomon is engaged in an intense spiritual warfare. He's really struggling. Okay, he's struggling with meaning. He's struggling with where's God in all of this. And those are questions we struggle with too. So it's not that he denies the struggle. Okay, it's just that we're being involved in his struggle. He could have actually just had this and then gotten straight to the conclusion. But maybe we wouldn't have ourselves found it so valuable. We might not have found his conclusions to have any weight. So we're here in the struggle. And he's looking at all the works that he had done by his hands. This is in verse 11. Okay, and all the labor that he had done. This is all all the self-gratification that he had done. He says that it's all grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. This is where he goes, when I'm just thinking in terms of the temporal realm, the physical realm, I can't find a meaning. I can't find hope. So what does he do in verse 12? Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. All right? He's doing both. He's embracing this is if it is Solomon, then this wisdom is something that God has given him. Remember when he was 12 and he ascends to the throne. He wasn't the first in line, okay, but he was the one eventually selected to be king. Let's be brutally honest with our dear brother David. King David didn't do a good succession plan. Okay, he didn't. He had lots of kids. King David had 18 wives. Okay, Solomon had way more. King David had 18. Well, actually, King David had 8 wives and 10 concubines, but he had a plethora of kids. The last wife was Bathsheba, and it's her kid, right, Solomon. So there are lots of. Solomon's actually the youngest, which is the biblical pattern. The youngest is the one God often chooses to do things. Okay, Isaac is chosen over Ishmael. Jacob is chosen over Esau. David is chosen over his older son, who was Reuben. And again, Solomon, Shlomo in Hebrew, he's chosen. He's the youngest out of all of them. So he probably didn't think he was going to inherit, when he was like 10. There was a family mess. There were some of the sons who either killed each other, and Absalom attempted his own rebellion. That didn't work out for him. And so David is on his deathbed. Actually, he's sort of like not feeling very well. And Nathan and Bathsheba are the ones that convince David Solomon needs to be king. Solomon then has a dream. God says, "You're going to be the Lord's anointed. You're going to be king. What do you want? Do you want long life? Do you want success over your enemies? Do you want wealth? I mean, what is it in your heart?" And at this young age, he says, "Give me the wisdom to rule your people." My gosh, that's a great way to start your career. He doesn't end well, unfortunately, but great way to start your career. And God says, "Excellent, I'll give you that. I'll give you all the other stuff too." But so he did become a great king. Built the temple, expanded the empire, the realm, did have success over his enemies, and did have largely peace, used his wisdom. Here, he takes that wisdom and he also explores madness. Why would you do such a thing? I hear you ask. I don't know, other than in his effort to find meaning without God, he explored the gambit of philosophies and things like that that were out there. And he says, I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. This sort of he will endure everything. He'll endure wisdom, but he'll also go and endure madness. And for what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he's already done. Well, at this point, if he's writing this, you would think, who's going to succeed you, Solomon? It'll be your son. Why haven't you taught your son to be smart? Because your son, Rehoboam, goes out and makes all kinds of mess, right? Just mess. And Jeroboam, Rehoboam, they split the kingdom, and so he doesn't manage to teach his kids well. He does say this, though. I saw that wisdom excels folly. Okay, in terms of weighing up different philosophies, wisdom is better than non-wisdom. Okay, and he says wisdom exceeds folly. Light excels darkness. Light is better than darkness. It is better to live in the light, that is, to have an enlightenment, to actually have some sort of wisdom and knowledge, and not to be in darkness and to have no understanding. The wise man's eyes are in his head, the fool walks in darkness. And so it's wisdom guides you and can keep you from stumbling, but the fool, he falls. He's the one that in the dark gropes around and falls. Yet he perceives in verse 14 that the same event happens to them all. What's that? Death. Okay, everybody seems to go to the same place. Everyone dies. And without God, that must be terrifying, right? That's where atheism ends in despair. Many of the atheists who are bold, outspoken, and brave tend to be the younger ones, the middle-aged ones, the ones who still have a sense of fitness to them, who still go around and move and do things. But when you start to approach that last 10 years of your life, then you start to have a little bit of a thought. Even our famous Richard Dawkins, who just despises faith, loves cathedrals. Why would you? If there's no God, you should never have built a cathedral. Think about that, right? If there was no belief in the divine and we all believed in nothing, why would you build big buildings? There'd be no point, okay? Why would you build anything? There would be no point. And that's the problem of when you think of life, mitachat hashemesh, just under the sun. There's nothing there. And that's what Kohelet is wrestling with. The same event happens to everyone. Death. Whether you're rich or poor, smart, or foolish, slave or free, if you're all in a bus accident, you all suffer exactly the same problem. If you're in a plane and the plane goes down, everybody suffers the same fate. And that's something that Kohelet can't have. He says in his heart, as it happens to the fool, it happens to me. Why then was I more wise? What's the point, he's asking? Right? I'm the king. I've got all this wealth. I've got all this power. I can have whatever I want, whatever my heart's desire. And that man down there who's poor, who's scratching on the streets begging for food, and the dog's licking his sores, etc., he shares the same fate as me. And he goes, why then am I more wise? I said in my heart, this is vanity. You get into the New Testament and you have roughly a very similar story, don't you? You have the poor man, Lazarus, and the rich man, and they both die. They both end up in a different place. One's happy and one's sad. And this is where, if you only think of the temporal realm, you have a problem. But when you put God into the picture, you think of eternity that is beyond the physical realm, there's a spiritual realm, things begin to actually find their value and meaning. For Solomon, or for Kohelet, he says, there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. If death is it, if when you close your eyes for the very last time, that's it, and you have no memory, and there's no ability to connect with what has gone in the past, then everything you've built, whatever it is, big or small, has no value. You can't take it with you. And thus the Kohelet is correct. It is indeed meaningless and no one remembers. From his perspective, remember, Kohelet, no one had come back from the dead. Right? There hadn't been people coming back from the dead to tell them what was there beyond the world. And prophets had only sort of, just been invented, so to speak. When do prophets arrive? Well, prophets really are there right from the beginning. That is, when the children of Israel come out of Egypt, it says that Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, the three people who lead them, are prophets. So Moses says there's going to be a prophet like me. So there is this thing called the prophet. And when you go through the period of the judges, there's a few, not many, a few. The real clincher, the guy who really kicks off the idea of prophet, the school of the prophet, is Samuel. And he ends up becoming the sort of foundation of the school of the prophet. And prophets work with kings. So you really only see prophets rise when you have a king. And they often worked against each other. Usually you would read in the Bible what the prophets did. The prophets would tell the king and challenge him. They were like the check and balance. Okay, they were like the opposition. Say, king, you're being an idiot. You shouldn't do this. And the king would then, if he was a good king, would actually get some wisdom from a prophet. But there'd also be bad prophets who would whisper into a king and do some bad things. And sometimes good kings got rid of the bad prophets. So there was a check and a balance. And every king that you discover in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Bible, each king had a prophet. Like David had Gad and Nathan. He actually had two. Some prophets, like Isaiah, lived through 4 kings, and it lists them. Some kings had multiple prophets, and some had none. There's one king who had no prophet. Guess who? Solomon. Why does Solomon not have engaged with a prophet? Maybe he thought he was too smart. And we discover that perhaps that's not so true. So even the man who had all the wisdom that there was to have under the sun, perhaps it would have been good to have a prophetic voice speaking into his life as well. But he didn't. And we see some of the results of that. So he's struggling with the idea that because he has no prophet to tell him about the afterlife or to give him wisdom from heaven, even though for King Saul, 2 generations previous, he had summoned up the spirit of Samuel. So there was this idea that the dead could come back, but not to do a heck of a lot. And so what's the conclusion in verse 17? If you have a look, therefore I hated life. Oh, my goodness, what a terrible sentence to say. Quite depressing, but if we're honest, a lot of people can sometimes go through those very dark places where actually life isn't happy. And I hate life because of the work that was done under the sun, tachat hashemesh, right, was distressing. For all the vanity and the grasping for the wind, he was struggling to find meaning in work, and he had done all these things. But it hadn't given him any joy, hadn't given him any lasting sense of hope, certainly hadn't given him any sense of hope. And instead, he decided, I hate life. Okay, what a terrible thing to say. You can really see that even in wisdom, the smart man can actually go through a dark time spiritually, emotionally. Here in verse 18, he hated all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. Right? He hasn't yet sort of added into his text what comes after under the sun. He says, because I must leave it to the man who come after me. Now that would have been one of his sons. And again, probably should have prepared them for it, but here he doesn't even name it. He just says, somebody will come and they'll take all my stuff, and it won't be fair. And who knows whether he'll be a wise or a fool? Well, if you'd bothered to teach your son, maybe he'd have some wisdom, but he doesn't. Yet it's almost as though this person is describing quite the dysfunctional relationship that he has with whoever will be his inheritor. And this is interesting when we think about it. The Bible doesn't hide dysfunctional families from us. Okay? When you read the Bible, you discover that there's all kinds of dysfunctional families going on in the text. Okay, Jacob and Esau, two brothers, they want to kill each other. It's not good news, right? And Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac, kicks Ishmael out of the house. What the heck's going on there? There's all kinds of issues that struggle. Jacob's kids, two of them go off and wipe out an entire city. I mean, there's all kinds of dysfunction. It doesn't hide that story from us, and rather it allows us to find ourselves in that story, where we can say, even despite the dysfunction, God works. Even despite the function, there's hope. Even despite the mess that I think that I've made, and it might have made some, okay, the mess can be put back together. And that's part of the good news that the church can offer the world. Okay, there's not many traditions that come about that say, actually, we can make this better. Part of the good news that we can actually share is come have a look at the heroes of old and realize that they're just like us. And the things that they struggle with are the same things we find. So when we're approaching this new year, one of the reasons why I thought Kohelet would be a good book to kick off with is whatever we're going through, okay, we can sit down and we can say, well, what are we going to turn our hearts to? We're going to turn it to despair. We're going to end up turning around hating life. Are we going to not find any meaning in the actions that we're doing? Or will we actually look a little deeper? We actually try and have a worldview that goes beyond just the temporal and see something beyond the sun and beyond the heavens, and see how that influences what we do and the way we view the world. And perhaps that will give us a sense of actual true meaning, give us the opportunity to repair the family and enjoy the gifts that God has given us, and sort of make sense of, even if it's only meager possessions, but make sense of the possessions and wealth that we may or may not have. And so in verse 20, he turns his heart and despairs of all the labor. So he unfortunately is at this stage not having such a good conclusion. All right. In verse 22, for what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, for which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work is burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This is vanity. This is hevel. This is meaningless, or this is futility. Poor guy, what's his conclusion? He's like, well, I'm in a really bad situation. I better make the best of it. Okay, in a couple of verses ago, he's like hating everything. I hate life. I hate the world. So then he says, nothing is better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. Interesting thing to say, that he now actually brings in the divine. The idea, how do you make the best of a bad situation? Well, carpe diem, seize the day. Eat and drink. Find some sense of joy in what you have, because it comes from God. There's a little hint here where he's beginning to sense that there's something else. But he really has been struggling with it. And if we remember from chapter 1, the sages will say that as part of his spiritual problem, he's actually being tormented by a demon who's been whispering all these lies. So a lot of the negativity in the sentences, that some of the verses that crop up, some of the Jewish commentaries will say this is the voice of the demon, right? This is the thing that's really sticking into his brain and telling him to hate life. You shouldn't. It's a gift from God. In fact, life is the most sacred part of creation. If you go into Genesis, the creation account tells us that God speaks life into everything. He just speaks, it happens, right? Create the sun, create the moon, create the stars, create the angels, create the planets, the animals. But when it gets to creating humans, God doesn't speak. He acts, he builds, he constructs, he forms Adam. And to make Eve, he uses part of Adam. But and then to make Adam work, he gives a piece of himself. He gives his breath. He shares a part of himself, not just to speak and say, Adam, get up, start walking around, but he breathes life. And so truly, in the foundation of our faith, life is the pinnacle of creation. You need to do everything you can to protect it and preserve it, and also to enjoy it, right? Enjoy life because it's a gift, and help others to enjoy life. And so here, eat and drink, make your soul happy in your labor. So not does he say that you could sit on your rear end and do absolutely nothing. No, the Bible talks about work as a good thing. Okay, actually doing and engaging in work as being something very positive. Work in Hebrew is avodah, and it's also the same word for worship. There is this idea that when you're engaging in the physical, you're also going to be engaging in the spiritual. And don't try and separate them, because what we've got here is our dear brother Kohelet has definitely tried to separate them. He says in verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? Okay, he's really gone and thrown his efforts into experiencing everything life has. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner, he gives work and the gathering and collecting. Okay, that's an interesting thing, okay? He doesn't see it as meaningless. He sees that God actually is involved in giving wisdom and giving work and helping to, it's part of his creation. The Gospel of John reflects this. For God so loved the world. It's not that God looked at the world and went, wow, these guys are a mess. Gee, I better go down there and sort stuff out. It's the impetus to go and do that is an act of love. Right? God loved the world. He didn't hate it. He didn't look at it and go, I don't find meaning. In fact, God did find meaning, and that meaning was love. And perhaps that's also something we can find in this year. What meaning can we give to the work of our hands? What meaning can we give even to our dysfunctional families or functional families? What meaning can we give to the world around us, if but love? To see the world as God sees it, which is not meaningless, but actually loving. And God gives wisdom and God gives work. So there is that tension of divine providence, that God is in control, but that never takes away from choice. This is that tension. God gives, God takes away. God's in control. But the scriptures will always tell us, choose life. Right? I have set before you paths of wisdom, paths of folly, a path of righteousness, a path of death. You've got to choose, and you are involved in the story, because love, which is what God so loved the world, and God asks us to love. He asks us to love him and to love our neighbor. Love can only come about through a choice. It can only come about by free will. You can only choose to love. It's not something that is forced upon you. You will love baked beans or whatever, Brussels sprouts, whatever you don't like. I mean, I actually like all of that stuff, but I imagine as kids we probably didn't. You'll love your enemies. That's a tough one. Okay. These are choices, and we can choose to do it. We might need some help, okay, to make the right choice. Pray for the Spirit, pray for wisdom, pray to make those right choices. But it's there. But it's also coupled with the idea of divine providence, that God is in control, or the sovereignty of the Lord, or in the way they talk about it in Hebrews, Malchut HaShamayim, the kingdom of heaven. That God's a king, and he's actually a good king. He's in control. And so I hope that you've wrestled some of the text with me. Chapters 1 and 2, okay, highlight the without the Lord, just looking at the meaning, the world under the sun, the world under the heavens, the temporal realm. The wisest of us can't find a sense of meaning. There's no sense of continuity. Nothing seems to last. Everybody gets the same fate. So he struggles with it. But he also realizes at the same time there's that tension. Wisdom's still better than madness, and light is still better than darkness, and blessing's still better than a cursing. Right? He still understands that there's a value system, but for anything to have value, it must also therefore have also a meaning, and can't be meaningless, otherwise it's valueless. But he's beginning to see that there's something else there. So it's setting up chapter 3, where the sort of negativity disappears, and we begin to get what ends up being a really good song by the Birds and a piece of poetry, right? To everything there's a season and a time and a purpose for everything under heaven. And then we'll go through that. But that is something we will wrestle with next week. Well, friends, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for being with me. And Maxwell, did you give your email? No. Okay. Next time, buddy. Okay, then I'll get you. Okay. Otherwise, let's give a blessing, or a dismissal, actually. Usually it's the priests give and bishops give the blessing. As a deacon, my job is to dismiss people. And a dismissal in the liturgical sense doesn't mean to say, okay, Bible study is over, everybody go home, smoke them if you got them, we're done. No, the dismissal is go now, and whatever we've learned, go now, put it into practice. Go now and love. Go now and choose to serve. Go now and find meaning in the world, because we will all meet our Maker, and He'll give us the true meaning of life. And that's a great thing. So, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Whatever you're holding, any angst or any tension, go in peace, the peace of the Lord. And go in peace to love and to serve, because that's part of the meaning, right? God so loved the world, we need to be able to do the same. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord in everyone you meet. In the name of the Messiah, Jesus, Amen. All right, folks, see you next week.
Hey, Canon Phil here. Thanks for being with us. If you appreciate the input from St. Jude and St. James, if you appreciate me continuing to speak out, could I ask you, would you support Deacon Aaron and myself as we attempt to procure this church building and pop over to democracy3.org/Save a Church. That's democracy3.org/Save a Church, and invest a couple of cups of coffee in us and put 10 quid into the fund. Every blessing, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.